So now let's spend just a few minutes on the situation analysis and get into some details about that. Situation analysis, again, is where we should ideally start. So it's in very much the planning phase so that we have a better lay of the land. Situation analysis is a survey of the individuals, community, social, political, behavior-related factors that can affect attitudes or behavior, social norms, and policies about health and its solutions. So it's not just about what is happening, but also hopefully gather some information about what would help to alleviate or to address some of the very needs that are coming up in the same analysis. It generates a full report that helps to spell out the communication environment and all of the audience-related factors. So you think about this as your lit review, your background. You're looking at all of the details so that you can make educated decisions from there with the community. So it's important to note that the situation reflects the degree and extent and priorities of the audiences with regard to particular health issues. So you're going in and you're not just looking at records, although situation analysis, certainly it's helpful to look at some of the census data, some of the epidemiology related reports that are coming out about particular issues and instances of disease or struggle, but that the situation analysis is really taking to heart and articulating to the fullest degree what the community themselves perceive to be the priorities around a given health issue, and which health issues of likely the many are of priority to them. So the situation analysis contains a lot of components, one of which is the audience profile. So that's where you get into the specific characteristics or demographics, needs, values, norms, attitudes of a particular key group. It is not a plan of action. It really is a roadmap. It is giving you this global overview of all these moving pieces. I go back to my analysis because it feels like it's just a life analysis of this big hairy ball of wax. And you can't just look at one hair. That sounds really gross. But you can't just look at one piece of it because you're then ignoring the context that informs how that one aspect functions. So it is a roadmap. So it can be very busy and very intricate and very complex because that's what life looks like in any given community. It also contains information about what has been done, what's worked and what hasn't, and what the common obstacles have been. So that gets to the solution piece. Inevitably, you're not the first people coming into a particular community or working with them. It's important to figure out what has already been tried, what has worked, what has failed miserably, and why it has worked or failed miserably. So it can be used in a lot of ways, and it's a wonderful overview, and sometimes it can be literally a map that spells out what's happening in the community. So it can be used as a planning tool for the community and you as the organization or consultants coming in, but it also can be used because you get a lay of the land enough that you can then reach out for funding, especially once the priority needs and ideas for solutions have been spelled out. So this is where we get into some of the more specifics and the steps of a situation analysis. It is such a useful tool and oftentimes a piece that's rushed through. So I encourage you in any capacity to take the time to go through this and do a full-fledged situation analysis. It's very much akin to a needs assessment, looking at all these different pieces. So in a situation analysis is where you define and understand the health issue from the key audience's perspective. Shocking. Identify the key groups of stakeholders and constituencies, so primary audience like we talked about briefly last week, those who you hope will directly benefit from the health communication intervention or a larger communication or strategy rather that health communication is a part of, as well as the secondary audience, so what you need to know about the very people who are influencing the primary audience or your key audience. You articulate social, political, and other determinants related to the particular health issue that the key audiences have identified and spelled out for you. It's also you develop and share and discuss an audience profile and segmentation report. When you're focusing, I'll go back to the example I used in the last little lecture snippet, focusing on young Latina women around STI prevention. By narrowing in to this key group, you close the door to others. To specify your messaging to females closes the door sometimes to men. You have to realize that you are having to channel and focus your energies to be more effective. If you do something too broad, you often lose. I also want to point out that your your key audience might be young couples, so that you are addressing not just men or women, but people in significant relationships. And that would make sense in many ways when talking about STI prevention. So I just wanted to put that little snippet in there, that your key audience doesn't have to be one particular gender or ethnicity. It can be a mix of things, or it can be focused on a pairing. It's always important here when you're defining these things and using definitions in your segmentation that are provided by the key audiences themselves, that you always hold on most high that the individuals that you're hoping to serve in this health communication intervention or broader health intervention is that they're the experts in their own lives. So always default to where that needs to go. And that the segmentation is well thought out, categories which may be divided by beliefs, living or working environments, ethnicity, occupation, status, in lots of ways. So think about what you need to know, and when you segment a group, all the key pieces that you need to then move accordingly. So if you are focusing on young Latina women around STI prevention, what does that look like in terms of getting to know the beliefs around sexual behaviors amongst that group of folks? What does that mean? What does that also mean then on how they prefer to be communicated with? So it's not just the demographics or the characteristics of the segmented group that you've established. It's also understanding the best ways to reach them. Next is research existing programs, initiative, and resources. See what else is out there. If you are working with a group of young Latina women in Buffalo, who's to say that what they've done in Southern California wouldn't also apply? And that way you learn from their lessons learned as opposed to recreating the wheel. Sometimes we have to come from the ground up and develop a program, but oftentimes there's things that we can pull from and make new mistakes as opposed to the same old ones that somebody else did. Situation analysis also highlights unmet communication needs. Generally speaking, you might be focusing on one thing to address, but it will also highlight other components of their experience where there's opportunity for intervention. It also, situation analysis describes overall barriers to program implementation and proposed change. This is a really important piece that I don't think we give enough time for oftentimes. We get busy thinking that we have really good ideas and that they're going to be really successful, and don't think about the lived experience of individuals and what might be in the way of them receiving or benefiting from the program that we have planned with them. And granted, when you're working with a community, this is harder to ignore, harder to perpetuate this idea that you have a good idea and that you don't think about the lived experience, but you'd be surprised how often it still happens that these barriers, people get so excited that they almost forget about what needs to happen for this to be successful. So it's this other little asterisk point down here that the information that you gather in a situation analysis is completely useless to your organization unless you share it with all those who participated. So I think about this in research in any capacity, that when you're working with people, you might then take whatever you've gathered and learned from a particular group of people, and then you as a consultant or the organization who has the funding and the power, quote unquote, to put together and implement a program, if you move forward without double checking to make sure that what you heard was correct, that it is representative of the people that you're working with, and that the program that you've developed on from that is, again, representative and in response to the needs that they articulated, you've already lost. So a lot of folks use this SWOT approach, which I'm sure a lot of you have talked about before in other classes, but the idea of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a good way to take what you've learned back to the drawing board to some degree with the key audience and stakeholders and say, this is what we heard, this is what we're doing, does this make sense based on your experiences and what you wanted to see out of this? Going back to this idea of shared goals and expectations for a program. So there's various ways in which we can conduct a situation analysis. Certainly research methods come in handy in this capacity. So you can look both in quantitative and qualitative methodologies, doing surveys of people and then also doing focus groups or individual interviews, canvassing a neighborhood like the example I gave in the last group. Ideally, this is community-based and participatory all the way through. as you'll always hear from me. The key communication research methodologies that are often used in a situation analysis are secondary data analysis, which is very familiar to those who have been looking into EPI, case studies, document review, in-depth interviews, focus groups, surveys, the list goes on and on and on. When you're thinking about situation analysis, it seems like so much work up front, but if you do so much work up front, everything else flows so much better from there. If you're functioning from a very grounded place in the needs and priorities established by the very community that you hope to serve, then there's also rapport, trust established, and there's more room for things to actually grow and change, versus if you don't spend some time on the situation analysis and truly have an appreciation for the lived experience of the very individuals you hope to work with and help to help, right? And help them help themselves. It just, right? It fails all too easily when we're not coming from that very rooted place. The trick is finding the time and the funding and the resources to do this very heavy lift up front. I wanted to just end on this note, which seems a bit tangential, but I promise it's not. Looking at market versus marketing research, when we're talking about health communication or program planning for the betterment of health behaviors or morbidity, mortality, you name it, we are talking about social marketing in so many ways. I just want to hone in on this one little piece just to remind us of how these things fit together, that market research refers to the process of gathering information about a market and its dynamics. So when people are trying to sell you something, there is market research. There is this idea that you go in and you learn the demographics and the characteristics of a population so that you can then market to them more effectively for them to buy your product. Marketing research refers to a systematic approach to research that includes more in-depth investigation of the market and its dynamics, includes needs, audience profile, etc. So marketing research is what we're doing in situation analysis in so many ways. We are trying to get a true lay of the land, a map of all these experiences and how they all hang together, so that we can plan more efficiently and effectively to gain the buy-in of the very people that we hope to help. And most importantly, that we are engaging the community in this whole process. So they're informing the process and they're helping to plan the process. So they're helping us conduct the research of their own community so that we all are on the same page. So we are still talking about marketing. If you take this out of context and switch the overall focus, right? Market research is focused on the benefit of the company. Marketing research is part of social marketing and helps us understand the lay of the land in the communities that we're working with. On that note, I'll leave you be and I'll see you next week.